I'd like to welcome you again to one of our Institute encounters, the fourth of the fall 2017 semester, and we're very privileged to have here today an old friend of mine and a great classicist, as well as champion of classical culture throughout American culture, Professor Kopff. Chris is on the faculty at the University of Colorado. He's both in the Honors College and in the Classics Department there. He's the author of many articles and books, including The Devil Knows Latin, which I've always suspected to be true. I've sometimes wondered whether God does, but the devil must, no doubt. And also, I should say, apropos our own existence here, the founder of a Western Civilization program at the University of Colorado. So welcome.
It's great to be here.
Nice to have you. There's a whole lot of things that we can talk about, obviously, but why don't we start with the work that you've done to revive the study of Latin as an academic field in our schools. It was once a commonplace that a person who sought education was going to learn the classical languages, Latin and Greek. During the 20th century, that faded, but it's coming back now. And tell us about the work you've done and why it's coming back.
Well, you're absolutely right. An educated person knew Latin and probably knew Greek. And even in the when the government started to measure public schools, for example, in the early decades of the 20th century, half the public school kids in America were taking Latin. Even as late as 1962, there were 700,000 public high school Latin students, and that didn't count Catholic schools, Episcopalian schools, Lutheran schools. So there's probably about 1 million kids taking Latin. Then came the 1960s. Well, we all know that's the black period for many reasons, and there were both positive and negative reasons. Partly was people convinced they had to change, partly because the Sputnik thing put a scare into people. The money that had gone across the board to academics went to what we now call STEM.
Mm-hmm.
Now, STEM isn't the reason why the great events of the 60s took place, because all those guys had earlier classical educations. Otherwise, they would have been old enough to fly in the satellites. But by the end of the 60s, the Latin enrollments were halved. By 1980-81, we were talking about 150,000 people knowing Latin. The other thing that was happening during that period, the high point for Latin enrollments is 1962. The high point for SAT verbals is 1963. And there is a tracking, whether or not there's I think there's a connection. There's a tracking as the verbals sink lower and lower and lower till they reach their low point, 1980-81. At that point, the math, which has been sinking, goes up. But the verbal sort of straightens out. And what happens is some very interesting people, one is a Calvinist minister in Moscow, Idaho, named Doug Wilson, began to take seriously the idea that the old education was better than the new education. He founded a classical school. It was heavily modeled on an essay Dorothy Sayers, the mystery writer, but also translator of Dante, had written, pointing out how rational the old system was. It was completely rational. And, for example, the arts of language are grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and that's exactly what you do with language. Speak grammatically, think logically, and then express what you have figured out convincingly, winsomely. And that's still the basic uses of language. Well, more and more people started being interested in what Doug Wilson was doing. At the same time, I was putting together a book for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which was going to be Kopff's greatest hits, something like this. And then we came up with the idea for the title. There was this wonderful Catholic priest in the first half of the 20th century named Ronald Knox. His biography, after he passed away, was written by Evelyn Waugh, of all the famous novelists. And one of the stories Waugh tells is in the 40s, a couple came to him and said, "Father, would you baptize our baby?" And he said, "Well, of course, I'm the priest. That's what I do. I baptize babies." Then they said, "Listen, Father, most of our family isn't Catholic. Would you mind doing it in English for them?" And Knox was usually the most mild-mannered of men, but he couldn't hold with this, and he refused. I won't do it, he said. The baby doesn't understand English, and the devil knows Latin. And when I came up with that, Jeff Nelson, the editor, said, well, we can't just reprint your old stuff if you're going to have a great title like that. You've got to write new things for this. And so about half the book it's really half and half. But a lot of the new stuff is precisely about the role of classics, its significance, and the growth of this new movement. And the new movement, although I wasn't involved with it at first, discovered me because of the title. And I got invited to their meetings, and our interaction was really interesting because they were 100% people who had not had classical educations. I belonged to sort of the last generation. I went to St. Paul's School in Garden City. There was a Latin requirement. I was part of both that group of large number of people who knew Latin and also the people who took the SATs in 1963, for example. And I saw my mission as going there and one, telling them how important this had been, important for the Renaissance, important for the American founding, important also really in early American history, and also how Latin was an essential part of this. Because remember, there's also the 7 liberal arts, arts of language, the arts of math, there's taking the past seriously. I mean, there are other aspects of classical education than Latin. But I saw my mission of trying to persuade people that Latin was an essential part of this. And I must say, I've been successful enough now so that I sometimes feel like I'm gratuitous when I go to the meetings, because I used to have to fight for Latin and explain it, and they would explain why Spanish would be better, or some other language would be better, or just as good, and I would come back with the other arguments. And it's really been years since I've heard anybody question the central role of Latin in classical education, both for what it gives students for the arts of language, and also, frankly, from the other point of view, as a brand. If you want Spanish for your kids, the public schools offer it, and often rather well, quite frankly, with a wide variety of teachers. But frankly, then you would give up everything else you get with classical education. Teaching Latin makes a very definite statement about how important language is, and also how important the past is. And that's tremendous. A few years ago, a very good classical educator who specializes in the homeschooling part, Susan Wise Bauer, teaches at William and Mary, and her mother, Jessie Wise, was another one of the founders from the homeschooling part. And I met Jessie a couple of times. And Susan gave a terrific talk at the Society for Classical Learning on the way that the arts of language function with one another, and how they represent different stages of a child's ability to handle facts, from simple memorization of grammar and vocabulary to actually learning the rules for logic, and then finally being able to create, to actually write a real paper.
Somebody would say, and you've heard it over and over again, if a good language education, particularly in a language that you didn't know from your cradle, and so you have to learn in a more formal way, gives you that sense of the underlying logic of language, why not do a language that people still speak and get a double benefit, like Spanish, which is one of the offspring of Latin?
Well, Susan not only used the argument that what about a living language opposed to a dead language, but also she said, my mother, who was a famous classical educator and homeschooling, gave me 8 years of Latin. I still can't read it as easily as I can read English, so I might as well read English. And the next year, having brooded about this for a year, because he was one of the few people I ever met frank enough to make the case with us. We know people outside our group make the case. And she made, and very logically, and again, winsomely, her rhetoric was quite good, it must be said. And there are several issues here. One is, if we didn't exist historically, it is true that any language would be just as good. But the fact is, we have grown up from the ancient world through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period, giving Latin and sometimes Greek names to what we use to talk about science, medicine, politics, philosophy, and politics. We don't just choose a leader. We elect a president. We elect senators and representatives. These are all Latin words. We can't speak about you can't talk about the American founding without talking about tyranny and talking about liberty and all these things that are so central to the way we talk and think. And the people who do law advising and medical advising all have noticed that it used to be sort of easy to teach first-year biology because a lot of the kids came in with a Latin vocabulary. Of course, the words are used slightly differently for science, but they still recognize their old friends being used for new scientific purposes. Well, now the kids come in, there's very few Latin students, and you spend your time teaching vocabulary. And tests for a long time have shown that there's more new vocabulary in a first-year biology course than in a first-year French course.
I say.
It used to be kids came in with this
We have
vocabulary.
a popular course here on Latin terminology. You don't learn the language, but you get the terminology for science or medicine or whatever.
Absolutely right. And we did the same thing, by the way. There was a big fight in the classics department between the young, old-fashioned people who didn't want to sell out teaching language and the smart, older people who knew that we'd get a lot of enrollments. And deans like enrollments, right? Deans don't really care if you're preserving Western civilization. They want to know if the classroom is full. And obviously they have to pay the bills. I mean, I'm not attacking paying the bills, obviously. But one of the issues that I dealt with is one, even a year of Latin gives you a feeling for not only a grammar, which many languages have, but for a vocabulary that'll help you as you choose a profession. But secondly, one of her key points was something that had actually been responded to by a figure you wouldn't expect, Friedrich Nietzsche. In his book, Morgenröte, the Dawn, he says, I am a classicist. That is, I'm a teacher of slow reading. And he said, the point is that you can't skip. If you're good at reading your own native language, you can skim and scan and get a lot of information out of it because you know how it works. With Latin, everything in the word matters. It's not just the base that gives you the meaning. There's also the ending that tells you how it functions.
Now that wouldn't have been true for Romans.
No, it wouldn't be true of Romans because that was their native tongue. That was their native tongue. They learned Greek. Greek functioned for them the way that Latin did. And Cicero would go back and forth as part of his training, doing things in Latin and in Greek, back and forth, because the strength it gave there, and the grammar is even more complex with Greek. It's closer to ritual Indo-European, and so it's still richer and more profound.
So is this a way of getting close to your roots, say, as a Westerner, or would it be equally advisable to do this in this modern age anywhere in the world?
Well, because of the way we've spread all over the world, and because of the way modern science, and in many areas, not all, consensual institutions have become important, Latin and also Greek provide the key vocabulary for science and consensual institutions. So yes, this is now important for people all over the world. And even in Europe, people will say, well, we know how important English is now. He says, but Latin helps you with your English. And I've read this in Germany, where Latin has also had a recovery, similar to as in the United States. And one of the arguments they use is because everyone says there, it's not Spanish, it's English. Shouldn't we learn a practical language like English? And by the way, you meet Germans and their English is fantastic, right? They've had 8 years of this language. And their own teachers say to them, yes, but the best way to improve your English is Latin. That gives you vocabulary, which in German we have our own words for it. But English, although English is technically a Germanic language, it has grown by taking Latin and making that the basis.
From the French, mainly, isn't it?
Well, first there was the initial, England was Britannia before it was England. So they were also, when the Anglo-Saxons came over in the 5th century, and Jefferson
They found the Latin-speaking, educated population.
And so, for example, there are a number of words, wallum, they take, winum, wine. By the way, we are the only language that preserves the original Latin w sound. Every other European language has gone to the v, vin, vino, vine, on and on. We have preserved, we still pronounce it the way the original Anglo-Saxons heard the Britons pronounce it, winum. We still call it a wall because wallum was the way it was pronounced. So they actually preserved the Latin pronunciation more. Then came the Christianity. That was the next big dose of Latin. Then comes the invasion, 1066, and all that. And that brings in French, but it also brings in both civil law, Roman law, and canon law, church law. Now, ultimately, the English stick with their common law. But many terms came to them through civil law and canon law.
So for a Germanic language, we have an unusually large and old dose of Latin.
Yes, and it's very, very old. Then when the Renaissance came, there was more Latin came in. Then when 19th century science comes, almost everything gets a Latin or Greek name. So that we have this, and by the way, I argue that that is likely to be true in the future, so that Latin will not only help introduce you to our culture and help us to find out about it, but when we come up with new inventions and new discoveries, the odds are it's going to have a Latin or Greek name. And if you know Latin, you're going to be ahead of the ball in being able to respond to the new things that I can't tell you about because they haven't been invented yet or discovered yet.
Though they're now beginning to name planets and asteroids after gods from other traditions.
They're starting to do that. Political correctness is there, and after all, we only have so many Greek and Latin gods, so you have to find some other things. And we have had since the Middle Ages, we've had a number of things with Arabic names because their science was an observational science, but it discovered things, and so there is still a number of that. So it's part of our tradition to assimilate. The problem is that where you keep the assimilation focused on Greek and Latin, the continuity of the culture goes forward. And when in my opinion, not everybody has to agree with me, tragedy of what happened with Islamic culture is that it became so rich for themselves that they felt they didn't need the classical anymore. And suddenly you see this fantastic high medieval culture, not a high culture, because they've, in my opinion, lost touch with
we're having
the
a
Greek
speaker
and Latin.
later who's going to kind of address some of that. But let me ask you about the teaching of, since we talked about how invaluable it is for kind of understanding the modern world as well as the ancient world. How is the teaching of Latin faring outside of Europe and the Americas?
Well, it is. Those are the key places where Latin's taught. And
do they teach it in China, to your knowledge, or how much is taught?
Not
in China?
to my knowledge. There are religious schools. Some of them will teach Latin, but for the most part, just knowing English is hard enough. And the instruction in language, it's interesting because both China and Japan are fantastically successful, prosperous cultures and on and on. But language is not their strong point in teaching. And it's interesting, you go to Europe and you go to those parts of Africa that have long traditions with French, for example, and you see people speaking completely, fluently European languages, and you meet very smart people from Japan and China who are important scientists, and not so much philology, literature they do, of course, but it's sort of disappointing. We're dead languages for them. They need it for their research, but they don't view the real command of it in the same way.
You would think in India it would be taught as a
India is
result of British
fantastic.
education.
India still has the British educational system. That's one reason why they've been able to assimilate to our scientific discoveries. Why they still have it's a wild democracy, but it's definitely democratic, and that's something which, of course, China we can see has not yet gotten there. Is nowhere near getting there.
Does knowing Latin give you a big leg up in learning modern Romance languages?
Knowing Latin gives you a big leg up in learning all the Romance languages. You can learn all of them more easily than with any one. Now, if you master French, you can learn Spanish very easily. So learning one Romance language well helps you learn other Romance languages. But if you learn Latin, you can learn all of the Romance languages. So it really, because historically there's this direct development. So and many of the things that seem peculiar, one of the things that's hardest for people in Italian is the pronunciation. Because everyone thinks you emphasize the second syllable from the end, but in fact it's often the third syllable from the end. Well, what is the reason for that? The answer is always the same, because that's the way they pronounced it in Latin.
I see.
We know how Latin was pronounced. And Italian preserves the emphasis.
Is Italian closer to Latin than the others?
It's very close. Yes, it is. It is. Especially in terms of the form of the words and the pronunciation.
I see. Could a Roman traveling forward in time find his way around speaking his Latin to Italians?
He would have been a little bit puzzled. A lot of the endings have dropped, but he would have, the vocabulary and the pronunciation of the vocabulary would have been close enough that he would have figured it out in a couple of days. He comes to Paris and he'd be baffled. He'd just be baffled. Historically, French is just as closely connected to Latin as Italian is, but they've changed it so much in pronunciation.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't sound the same when you
They
listen
didn't get a
to it.
dose of German up there in France?
I think they got a lot of dose. In
Yeah.
fact, they call themselves Franks,
Yeah,
which is
right.
a type of German.
Mhm.
I mean,
So that's influenced modern French too.
yes, absolutely, to a big degree, and to the way, and also they developed more independently. Italy remained closer to. I mean, the Vatican ruled half of Italy for most of the Middle Ages, so Latin remained a very lively kind of reality. Dante, when he meets Virgil in the underworld, assumes that Virgil writes in Latin and can speak in informal context, but has his own native dialect,
Uh-huh.
because that's what everybody in Italy did in those days. Now we know that isn't true. Virgil knew Latin; he didn't know the dialect of Verona, or whatever. But Dante assumes that because everybody in his day, every educated person in his day, wrote and spoke Latin in formal contexts, and then used their native dialect to talk to their friends or write love poetry. His big deal was actually writing a great epic poem in Italian. That, of course, was quite striking. But when he wanted to make a serious intellectual point, as he did about monarchy, he wrote that in Latin.
So if someone said, well, Latin's all well and good for understanding how modern languages, particularly technical languages, operate, but if what your interest is in sort of getting to the taproot of Western culture, shouldn't you study Greek?
And yeah, the answer is yes. Greek is very important. A pure classical education studies Greek and Latin. Historically, Latin has been the vehicle in the West through which we've taught the grammar and given the major vocabulary to major areas going on. If you want a fulfilled knowledge of that Latin and that culture, you need to go back to Greek. You need to do it for science, because the Greeks were the ones who really invented science, and their way of thinking is what structured science. You need it for for Christians. You need it for the New Testament. There also actually are very important parts of the Jewish tradition, like First Maccabees and like Ben Sira, Ecclesiasticus, that are in Greek. So you've got all these areas where, yes, a really educated person is going to want to have Greek to give the complete picture of the West.
So let's put you in the role of an education reformer. If we're going to have Latin and Greek seriously studied, Greek especially, I'm told, and perhaps this is wrong, but I'm told it's more of a challenge than Latin is for most people. It's a more difficult language to study.
It's more complex grammatically.
In order to make room for those things, what should we get rid of in the curriculum?
Well, this sounds counterintuitive.
And all your colleagues are watching this here.
But yes, we need early on in the first 8 years especially, and even the first 12 years, we need less science and we need more math and language. The fact is, kids arrive at college with their AP chemistry and their AP biology. If they're going to a good school, at the University of Colorado, which has good departments in those areas, they have to be taught from scratch again, because things have moved so fast that the AP book, remember, was out of date when it was written, and by the time it's taught to them, it's 10 years out of date, and so you have to start all over again. And so the time we should spend more time teaching math. Math is essential for almost every significant science. And we should spend more time teaching Greek and Latin to give us the grammatical knowledge we need and the vocabulary we need to talk about these things. Then when they go to college, they will be ready to take the science, because they will have the math they need, having spent a lot of time on it, and they will have the vocabulary. They won't sit there in biology class going, what's that word again? They'll recognize the word right away, and in Greek. And so if we were rational, we would be 12 years of math and Greek and Latin, frankly, and then in college we would start doing the science and the other
Now
things.
that's college prep. Not everyone is going to probably or should go to college. A different track for them, I guess?
The track would be a more practical math with more statistics and things like that, and a concentration on either Greek and Latin. Latin will do them the most good. But Latin can help anybody. There's a wonderful classical educator named Cheryl Swope who has she adopted children who were mentally handicapped. She gave them a classical education. They're kids that were, when she first got them, were ranked as severely retarded with low vocabularies, now can read at a high school level. And the doctors are amazed because they believe in biology, right? I mean, biology is fate. If you have, and they by the way, they still have these. They're Downs, I believe, but I'm not an expert. But they are, it's not just that they're lively, and because a lot of Downs kids are, I mean, they're wonderful kids. But these kids can actually read. The little girl writes short poems. So it not only is this absolutely essential for a very creative person, it's very good for an ordinary person. It even makes people who are challenged intellectually better, more like everybody else.
I would think that one of the arguments for studying Latin is that it does give you a kind of rootedness in your civilization. You're sort of back there with its fathers and mothers, I guess we'd have to say.
Yes.
And just that process alone, being immersed in it, kind of naturally gives human beings a certain degree of reverence. Would you think that's an argument as well?
It gives you reverence and it gives you perspective. And Albert J. Nock talked about this in Theory of Education in the United States. He says, someone who has this education looks upon modern events with a perspective that is not there. We look at Afghanistan and we say, you know, Alexander the Great found it easy to invade Afghanistan, but he never conquered it. He married a local princess and got the heck out, declared victory and retreated. And that's just one specific example, but there's case after case. Also remember, both the Athenians and the Romans had consensual institutions, democracy and republican forms. And it's something that makes them so much more relevant. When Socrates talks about the arguments against civil disobedience in the Crito, he's assuming a society where you can immigrate, where you can persuade, where you can debate. Well, the fact is, his arguments are irrelevant for most of world history and most people, but they're directly relevant for us. He lives in a society that is more like ours than any that existed, and the Romans would be next in line.
Is it your experience then that people who are professional classicists, let's take that as one category, or people who have seriously studied the classics during their course of education, are wiser than others? Do you think that rubs off in some way? What's your impression there on?
You have to believe, and this is where many classicists would not fit that description, because you have to believe that the past has knowledge and beauty that we don't have. You have to believe that tradition preserves a wisdom from generations and millennia that is more than any individual, any group of people, any generation today have. If you accept that, when you accept that, then yes, it makes you wiser, because you have the wisdom of thousands of years of very smart people telling you, and by the way, ordinary people too, telling you, yes, this works, no, that doesn't work. And it's something that's very hard to get across because we're convinced that, you know, don't stop thinking about tomorrow, yesterday's gone, as the Clinton campaign's campaign motto.
Before you start studying the classics, you should first read Burke. Is that...
Burke is an example of a classical education, and he is, every once in a while there are arguments that try to turn him into a modified Enlightenment philosophe. And even Gertrude Himmelfarb has a short essay on the way Burke is like an Enlightenment figure. But the fact is, essentially, Burke is a traditionalist who knows the classics, who knows the lesson they give, who can see what's going. He predicts what happens in France because he has 2,000 years of experience. And Thomas Jefferson had the same good education, but he was there and he talked to Lafayette and said, well, it'll be different this time. It'll be different because we're the modern world.
Were there Burkeans in the ancient world, people who made arguments about the accumulation of wisdom through eons of cultural evolution? Is that something you find among ancient thinkers too?
Obviously, ancient Greek thinkers are very excited by what they're discovering and the growth of logic and on and on. But Plato has great respect for tradition and talks about it. Aristotle, in the section of the Metaphysics where he talks about the unmoved mover, says, look, we know that myth is full of a lot of silly stories, but the basic story behind myth is there is a divine, and that divine shapes our world. And that is true, despite all, that part of tradition is true. So even Aristotle, who was probably the least traditionalist in most ways, understood that at the deepest level, even myths that were full of all kinds of nonsense preserved a truth that a philosopher can have access to.
To take a related subject, classics departments have been, over the last 30 or 40 years, shrinking. And I suppose part of that is due to either not enough students coming into college with some foundation in Latin or Greek, and not that many students wanting to kind of engage it in some serious way after they're there. The turnaround in Latin education, and maybe Greek, you can tell me that, at the lower levels, is this beginning to show up at the collegiate level? Are more and more students coming in who want to pursue majors in classics?
Yes. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is back in the 60s, classics taught every single level of language because kids came in from not only Catholic and Lutheran Episcopal schools, but from public schools, able to take all different levels of Latin. You could offer the whole range of it. You offered very few courses in translation. You didn't need to. And Spanish, by the way, basically teaches Spanish. They don't have translation courses. Now, about half of all classics courses are translation courses meant to get the enrollments to please the deans. And then also, when the Latin class or Greek class is small, you say, hey, we're teaching 300 people in myth. Allow us to teach 7 or 10 people in Greek or Latin, and most deans are reasonable about that. Classics is doing very little as a profession to take advantage of the popular groundswell in favor of it. They're embarrassed by it.
Why are they embarrassed?
Because they want it. They hang around. Most of the people who run the profession are big schools, important schools. The growth in Latin is in classical charters, parochial schools, and private schools. A lot of these kids are going to religious schools. So there is now a great growth in jobs in, Houston Baptist College and schools like that.
In classics.
In classics. The people in the big schools they're embarrassed about these people. One, they don't want to be associated with Christians because we know how terrible that is. Secondly, they feel that the story that people like I tell, I'm not the only one, there are other people doing this, are narratives of exclusion. Where's your Egyptian thing? When I teach the general introduction to ancient history course, which I've done over the years now and then, the first week is always the great Near Eastern cultures. I don't exclude them. And at the end of the course, Alexander the Great conquers them. Again, that can be viewed as imperialism too, of course. But the point is that is a great common civilization. It is ultimately joined together by Greek culture and then Latin culture. And I think that's an important truth. And we want to understand Egypt, we want to understand Mesopotamia, Iraq. We need to understand that whole long history that goes back to the Greeks and Romans. But they are embarrassed by it. They want to have meetings in which they explain that we're not promoting the Roman world was extremely multicultural, which it was, of course, but also had a common language, which was Greek for the most part, except
in
for
the East. Yeah.
Yes, especially in the case of law and army, of course it was Latin because the language of the army is Latin. But otherwise, you had a united culture. You had one that was increasingly urban. That was part of Alexander's vision, was to start building these Greek cities, and then Greek culture would spread. And Alexandria remained a model of a Greek city all the way to late antiquity. And there's somehow this, one of the things we don't do, for example, at the professional meetings is quite striking. You have something on reception. How did later ages misunderstand the classics? And people come in and explain that. But if you submit something on tradition, the living effectiveness of the classics in the Renaissance, in the Reformation, in the founding, today, doesn't get accepted. And we've been, because of
They won't accept a paper on those?
They won't accept, my experience is they won't accept papers and they won't accept panels. And because of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, we've been sending in things like this, because Latin and classics is and Greek is very important to understand the Reformation. And the answer is what they want is reception in which later ages misunderstand the classics. Fortunately, we understand them, so we can correct John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and these people when they misunderstand.
And our new understanding, as they would put it, of the classics is one that kind of chucks out all the lessons that somebody like John Adams would have seen as important in Roman and Greek history, and substitutes what?
Well, let me give the Roman historical part. What the founders learned from the Romans, both the ones who wrote Latin and Polybius, the great Greek writer, is separation of powers, balance of powers.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the big things they got. That's why you need 2 houses of a legislature, why you need 3 branches of government. All this is essential. And people who didn't take it seriously, like Ben Franklin, said, no, we only need 1 legislative house. And there are places in the United States even. I come from Colorado, so our view of Nebraska is very low. And
Right. Well, Pennsylvania originally had a single.
that was Ben Franklin.
Right.
That was Ben Franklin. His first big defeat in the Constitutional Convention was the vote to go for bicameral legislature. Well, see, modern historians say, oh, well, you see, actually, the Roman power elite ran everything. The assemblies were a farce. They were all run by the clients. It was just a bad. It was a delusion that they had any. Now the fact is, there is fantastic research done in the past generation by English scholars showing that Polybius was right. That in fact the assemblies did affect what was done. They did change the way the leadership forced things to happen. And I've had great fights in this, including at the Liberty Fund, which is this great conservative group where conservatives come together, and the professional historians all say, oh well, you see, the assemblies were a joke in the ancient Roman times, and our founders were under delusion. Now we're glad they were, because in fact, in the great day of America, Congress used
Worked
to
out
be
pretty well,
very
didn't it?
important.
Yes.
And one of our worst problems we have now is that Congress would rather do nothing.
Well, they had the English tradition too, which at that time was a division of power as well.
That also,
Yeah.
well, let's put it this way: it was analyzed that way.
That's what Montesquieu thought, and
It was Montesquieu who taught them that we should ignore what we actually see happening in England and interpret them in light of the ancients, which is the bicameral legislature, the king is the executive, on and on. And that is why Montesquieu was so influential. By the way, Montesquieu is often viewed as an Enlightenment philosopher. In my opinion, he was not. He believed in the ancient tradition. He believed that Tacitus. He believed that the French were great because they were Germans. He believed that the English were great because they were Germans, in Tacitus and Germania. And we know that Thomas Jefferson thought the same thing, because his initial publication, which helped sway Virginia's decision to join the constitutional, the first Congressional Congress, was to say, look, when our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, Hengist and Horsa, came to England, they owed nothing to the Germans back there. When we Germans came over from England and settled here, we owe the people in England nothing either. And by the way, Ben Franklin read this and thought it was hilariously funny and issued a phony proclamation from Frederick the Great insisting the English pay him the same taxes that the English were insisting the... And Franklin tells the people who are going, outrageous, this German, how dare he? And other, of course, smarter people are saying, well, it's funny, it's the same demands we're making of our colonists.
well, let's come back, because I don't want to tread too much on your talk in the evening. Let's come back to contemporary classic departments, which you're suggesting have been unable, thus far at least, to make much of a genuine ferment that's occurring in the teaching of language, ancient languages at the lower levels.
Yes, they want to get along with their colleagues, and there's a massive consensus that I got all the great writers in the 20th century who say the opposite of this, that the past doesn't matter, that innovation is the thing that we're all about, that when the past does differ from us, they're just wrong. And by the way, they're often bigoted and narrow-minded. It's not just that they're wrong, everybody's wrong, but that they're actually corrupt in what they hold. And trying to say, look, you can't promote it. If you really think that, you really ought to, work in a Dairy Queen or whatever would be the appropriate thing to do. And there are large numbers of writing, and when you stand up and say, we need to tell our students that they need us, because the sciences all believe that. They're not going around saying, which by the way they could say if it won't be the truth, actually most of you bio majors are not going to go to med school, sorry. No, they say this stuff is important, and whatever your future career is, and we all hope it's med school, don't we? Yay, and all the kids deluded, thinking they're all going to med school. But there's still a lot of science jobs out there if you don't go to med school. And that's true also in physics, and that's true. They believe. Well, if we don't believe in what we're teaching, if we don't think that, in my humble opinion, consensual institutions and the religions of the Bible are more important than science, I don't want to do without science. If we have to make a choice, though, I don't want to see consensual institutions go away, because people can't even speak the language of freedom. And they can't debate because they don't know rhetoric.
I don't think you'll have free science long without consensual institutions.
It won't last very long. It's already science.
The dogma will kind of prevail.
It's going. The dogma will live loudly within them, as a senator referred to another religious tradition. But we've already seen things where you're not allowed to not just disbelieve, but question. Are you really sure that, or even, we see it in area after area. And one of the areas where we should be doing the most is precisely working on one reason why physics has done so great is they sort of just go for broke. And Werner Heisenberg, in fact, you can say, when I was doing my major research, I got most of my inspiration from reading ancient Greek. His Greek was so good he could read Plato's Timaeus, which is really hard, by the way. And the idea was, what he learned from Plato is you trust the math no matter what observation tells you, then you start looking. And that's where he got the big fight with Einstein, of course. Einstein saying, I believe that he doesn't play dice, right? And Heisenberg would say, the math works. And furthermore, we can do experiments. We can't test everything about subatomic particles. We can do experiments that confirm that the math works. And they never agreed on that. In 1950s, they got together again in Princeton, and Einstein was still going, ich bin überzeugt, dass würfelt nicht. Okay, that's fine. Biology, frankly, is sort of in a dead end now because it won't question its premises. And it needs, and the classics are the place to go to find grounds for questioning what's going on. There's just, the world is more, not only is the genome more complicated than we ever imagined, but human beings are more complicated. And by the way, how long is belief in freedom and human rights going to survive if we're all just evolved matter that have randomly achieved what we are? Somebody's going to win or lose there, because they're absolutely, we're teaching people in our political science and humanities classes that there's human rights and that people have freedom and that they should have freedom. When they don't have freedom, it's bad. We're teaching people in biology classes that we're evolved blobs of matter.
You think we're dismissing teleological notions sort of out of hand?
We have dismissed them for the past 200 years, and we've got to get back to taking teleology seriously.
Which Aristotle
did. And there is...
in our terms at least, a non-theistic teleology in his case.
Yes, that's exactly right. And there are philosophers out there who do have a very strong teleological and even non-material vision, which is not, however, theistic. Now, for those of us in theistic traditions, we say, well, the easy way to explain it.
Who's an example of a contemporary guy like that?
The Nagel in NYU has written this wonderful...
That's right, yes.
He is, from my perspective, he's an Aristotelian. I don't know whether he calls himself that. But he believes that there is consciousness. In fact, panpsychism is named his theory. Written a great essay on what's it like to be a bat, which has consciousness. And argued that we are going to lose ethics and we're going to lose even beauty if we insist on our current worldview. But one of the things
totally
we're going to...
mechanistic
Yeah,
world.
totally. Yeah. And he said explicitly in so many words, we have to give up on Darwinism. Darwinism is a dead end at this stage. No one's denying the great discoveries that happened in the context of Darwinism. But we've now reached a stage where we've reached a dead end. And they're simply continuing to butt their heads against this, instead of saying you are not only going nowhere as scientists, but you are also destroying the basis for our political institutions, our ethical beliefs, and even our aesthetic beliefs. And it's very convincing. And of course, Daniel, David Daniel and Richard Dawkins ran around the room with their fingers in the air shouting, shut up, shut up, shut up, which I always find a very convincing argument. We can all agree it's one of the most convincing ones you could have. But right now here in Texas, Professor Rob Coons at UT Austin,
who's been here and been on this show,
and as a great supporter, as we know, of Centers for Western Civilization. He has a brand new book out on neo-Aristotelian views on science, arguing that if science is already moving in this direction, if it wants to continue to have progress, it has to go back to neo-Aristotelian views.
Though I should say, and our regular viewers and the millions out there will know, that our speaker before last was on literary Darwinism. So
Well,
we are a pluralistic discourse here.
yes, absolutely. And there's no reason to deny all the great discoveries that happened in the context. There's also no reason to deny, really, people should read Lucretius on the nature of things, because the fifth book of Lucretius, it's all there. The Darwinism is there. And
It's
so
a
ancient.
wonderful book.
It's a wonderful.
And the mental experiments that he does, the Gedanken experiments.
The Gedanken, as Einstein said.
There are such wonderful anticipations of how you think scientifically about testing propositions.
Yes.
It really is marvelous when you read that.
Absolutely. No,
And done poetically.
and done in poetry to teach you that there doesn't have to be a radical disjunction of humanities, and it's surely not an accident that Charles Darwin's grandfather Erasmus wrote poems about science, because that was the great Lucretian tradition.
What was Darwin's education, do you know?
Classical education. He went to Oxford.
That
He
was
had Greek
true of
and Latin.
Marx as well, wasn't it?
Marx not only had a classical education, he had a PhD in classics.
He wrote on Epicurus?
He wrote on Epicurus, and he wrote on the Prometheus of Aeschylus,
Uh-huh.
which he viewed as an atheist document.
Have you read his dissertation?
I haven't read his dissertation.
It would have been in German, I assume.
I assume it would have been
Or
Latin. I assume in the middle 19th century.
mhm.
I'm not 100% sure, because
Yeah.
there was already some German dissertations.
Yeah.
But for the most part, German dissertations were in Latin, and by the way, German classics classes were in Latin, because people came from all over, and more people knew Latin than German.
Mhm.
So when you look at, I've studied a few ancient 19th century classes, not Marx, and there, in the middle of the 19th century, they're all lecturing in Latin. So Latin was still a dynamic purveyor of discovery.
Has the Catholic Church started to reconsider its views on Latin?
It has reconsidered it. Pope Benedict legalized the use of Latin Mass. Had he stayed in longer, that was one of his big commitments. He set up an institute in Rome to promote Latin. He allowed people to use the Latin Mass again, because part of the great freedom of Vatican II was to forbid. There's a freedom for you, forbid people from doing it. Yeah, I mean, it's slowly sinking in to some smart people that no church has grown after it got rid of its traditional liturgy. And listen, we got to get rid of our traditional liturgy because nobody will come to our. But the traditional liturgies are precisely what people come for, frankly. Also, they're beautiful.
The Greek churches have held on to them.
The Greek churches have held on. Even the Episcopalians, though they've monkeyed with there, still is a lot of the original beauty still there. The latest hymnal from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod includes as one of the alternatives the old service. And this, of course, there are no liberals in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, but there are moderates. The moderates were very unhappy. If you give people a chance to use the traditional service, they'll all use it. That was their argument against it. And you say, well, yeah, that was kind of the thought, really. The fact is, our old hymnal from 1941 is still in print, because there are still people who'd rather have the beautiful old service than the, it's not ugly at all, but less beautiful modern services. So we are seeing churches slowly but surely sort of get more realistic. And again, this is a case where the past is more important, where the past preserves beauty and significance that we can't do. We're not good enough to do it anymore.
So let me conclude by asking you whether in the classics profession, and perhaps looking out around the various departments across the line, classics departments, are there places that are kind of recovering the old sense of mission and trying to serve as propagation points for a teaching of the classics, not only that makes Latin and Greek more important, but also that kind of recovers a respect for classical antiquity and the lessons it has for today?
You go around the country and you look at the private schools, the religiously based schools, traditional schools, you see they are offering humanities and they're offering classics. The best jobs in classics now are
Any big
schools
public
like this.
universities or big major privates that do this?
No, I think it's pretty clear to say a number of them, what they do, and we see this in Boulder, we see this in UT Austin, is promoting archaeology, which the administration likes, and then making language requirements, on and on. So there are schools that are smart enough to see there are ways. The problem is you have to get along with you can't go to your administrator and say, we're going to ignore what all your friends are telling you at the professional meetings, and we're going to insist that the past is more important, that our institutions depend upon that, and that we are going to promote that, not constant. The innovation will come when our students graduate and they innovate. You can't teach innovation. You can teach these great traditions, and then the kids, as part of the traditions, then do new things. They add to the tradition. Nobody can go to a dean and say that, because the dean will fire you and insist the department elect somebody else's chair. What you can do is say, well, we're doing creative things in archaeology, and we really need a language requirement, and then basically make that a lead-in to classics. So that's what the state universities are doing,
So,
when they're smart.
Through indirection.
They have to do it through indirection because the pressure is, otherwise they'll take your positions away. They're doing it anyhow, right? It's very hard to keep a position when someone retires or even gets a job at another place. They love to give the position away to the sciences.
Well, you've persuaded me. I started this accepting, because I had read the book, that the devil knows Latin. I figured God knew Hebrew, but now I'm persuaded that he knows Latin too. I suspect a lot of other languages as well. But thank you, Chris.
It's been great to visit here. It's great to talk to you, Steve.
Thank you.